And then we have Antonija Petričušić from University of Zagreb in Croatia. And she will be speaking on Ivo Josipović's role in post-conflict reconciliation, former president's historical consciousness that lacked legitimacy and support in wider society. All right, Dr. Petričušić, we are now happy to hear your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Antonija Petričušić. My surname is complicated even in my own language, so don't worry about mispronunciation. I hope you're fine with me inviting my son, who showed interest in joining me at the table. His name is Marko, and he's accompanying me to this conference in New York. The topic of my presentation is about the role of the former Croatian President Ivo Josipović in the post-conflict reconciliation process that is taking place in Croatia, my country of origin, in the course of the last 22 years. The structure of the presentation will be as follows. First of all, assuming that majority of you are not well and sufficiently familiar with the conflict that took place at the beginning of 1990s in Croatia and also in some neighboring countries, I will offer or give a little socio-political introduction to the conflict that took place in that time and that bears consequences to present days in those countries of the region. Then I will try to argue that public apologies might be used, of political leaders might be used as a first concrete step towards reconciliation in post-conflict setting. And finally, I will say something about the real attempts of the former President Josipović in pursuing reconciliation in the region, packing all that in the context of accession of Croatia and other countries of the region to international organization that is called European Union, which is luring those countries into membership for the past, let's say, 17 years, because all countries of the region has demonstrated their political will and set membership into the European Union as their political goal. So the methodology I use in my paper, analyzing the messages of the former President Josipović, was discourse analysis, meaning that I consulted his public speeches that are available on his webpage, as well as different newspaper articles and news articles in which I was able to find reconciliatory messages that were voiced, thank you, during his president's term. So first of all, something about recent history. I'm sure that the Yugoslav conflict of early 1990s has reached your years because it was the first conflict in Europe after the Second World War, and Europe was considered to be a peaceful continent until that time. The dissolution of Yugoslavia resulted in 7 new republics, independent states that came into existence, but unfortunately everything happened in a very violent way. As a result of the series of interethnic wars and aggressions, because the nature of those conflicts were dual, not only civic wars between different nations within one country, but they were aggressions from foreign countries to certain countries, resulted in the death of 140, this is the estimate, 140,000 people, and only in Croatia, my country of origin, 20,000 people were killed in the course of 4-year-old conflict. Majority of killings in Croatia took place or happened in 1991. And some of the killings happened at the end of the war that lasted from 1991 to 1995, when some liberating actions by the Croatian force took place in summer of 1995. Most of those conflicts, you can go on, no problem. Most of those conflicts in former Yugoslavia were brokered, most of those ending of the conflicts were brokered by peace treaties by international organizations, and very often also the US, who was a very significant player in bringing peace to the region, because only after the United States administration involved into the conflict by either logistically supporting some governments or also pursuing some military activities through NATO, the conflicts were actually seized in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that was the most serious and severe battlefield in those 4 years, because the conflict there was much more violent than in Croatia. Probably some of you heard about the terrible act of genocide that took place in 1995 in Srebrenica. It was an ethnic enclave in the eastern Bosnia where Muslims were surrounded by Serb army. And as an act of revenge, the Serbian army, not only local Serbs from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from that part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also from neighboring Serbia, in the course of several days massacred 8,000 Muslim men, boys, and old men, elderly men, in order to pursue ethnic cleansing of that territory. And that act also served as a warning moment for the international community to get involved into the peace process, which was eventually set in this country, in the military base of Dayton, Ohio, I believe, where Dayton Peace Agreement was achieved between Croatia, Serbia as two neighboring states, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is the moment when the peace building processes have started to slowly enter those countries, but mostly moderated and financially backed by international community, not from the ground in those countries. So I will go back to Croatia, which also had its conflict with rebellious Serb minority, who disliked the idea that proclaimed independency proclaimed or proclamation, I'm sorry for not knowing this word well, of Croatian authorities of early 1991, the Serbs lost their constituent people status, so they were turned into the status of national minority, and some of the Serbs feared that could lose to their physical deprivation or threat, and they seek the independence from newly proclaimed state, and they wanted to remain the part of former Yugoslavia that existed at that time, because Serbia as a republic came into existence only in 1993. So they seek protection from Yugoslavia, and Yugoslav army intervened into Croatian territory, taking the side of rebellious Serb minority, and the conflict started in 1991. It was frozen in spring of 1992 and remained like that until 1995. 1/3 of Croatian territory was occupied by the rebellious Serb and Yugoslav army. And eventually in 1995, with some military operations and then peace accords, it was brought to an end. As a result of that, social ties between Serb minority in Croatia and Croatian minority remained weakened, and there is still a problematic cleavage between those two communities, which are not only on ethnical base but also on religious base divided. We also have to take into account that Croatia existed as an independent state shortly in the Second World War and was on the wrong Nazi side on that time. So the discourse of this fascist collaboration of Croatian authorities was very often invoked by the Serbian leaders and lingers in the minds of Serbian population, who feared also in 1991 that Serbs might be also brought into position of threat due to raising nationalism that was taking place in newly independent state of Croatia, as it usually happens when states are being formed and the nation building processes are being condemned, so people tend to have high levels of nationalism. We can maybe go on. After the conflict was brought to an end in 1995, the rightist nationalist government was in power throughout the whole this century of 1990s. And since the politics towards Serbs as a national minority was not assessed as a decent one, Croatia was suffering from international isolation in the second part of 1990s. And with the change of government in early 2000, the reapproachment towards international organizations had started. So Croatian government that was elected in 2000 and that was led by liberal left, let's say centrist left coalitional government filed an application membership to the European Union. And eventually in 2005, the official process of Croatian joining to the European Union started. Why this outsider impact on the society, on the politics is important? It is important because the European Union set an agenda of reconciliation in its accession politics. So the European Union decided to address the violent conflict of the Western Balkans, but by setting up new conditionality for those countries of the Western Balkans that were involved in interethnic conflicts and war, and asked them in the set of political criteria not only to develop legislation and institutions for inclusion, integration and protection of national minorities, which was a novel element for first of all, for countries of Eastern and Central Europe that was introduced in 1993 already. But European Union also asked for additional set of criteria that were addressing violence, wars and conflicts. And it asked that all those countries of the Western Balkans who showed interest in joining European Union needs to prosecute their war crimes, both before domestic courts and before the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia that was set back in 1993 in The Hague in the Netherlands, under the auspices of the United Nations. European Union also asked those countries to get involved into reconciliatory processes with their neighbors to show the hand of cooperation and reapproachment, both in economic terms but also in political and societal terms. And therefore, all the acts of forgiveness or showing the apology from the side of political leaders can be analyzed and seen from that kind of discourse as a kind of political socialization that was imposed by the European Union on those societies and their political leaders. So my interest was also to see if public apologies in the literature of conflict resolution studies can be conceptualized as a theoretical frame for post-conflict reconciliation, and by examining literature I came to several different conceptualizations of public apologies that are listed over there. I opted for the one, we can go on, I opted for the one that suggests that public apologies can actually be part of what literature calls external socialization. So when an international entity or external entity is imposing as a value system that should be embraced by the society or by the political organization. And exactly this is what was the case with the European Union, who asked the authorities of Croatia in the course of the EU accession process that lasted from 2005 to 2013, when Croatia became a member state, to act in a certain way in order to fulfill political criteria for the accession. Unfortunately, those requirements were only tackling political leaders. Oh my God, I have only 2 minutes. But not the wider society, because obviously the course of the EU accession was very short, only 8 years. and it's impossible actually to change the mentality or the value system, predominant value system of the society in the social climate that was filled with nationalism, with suffering, with victimization, and inability of Croatian population to face that Croatian soldiers in those in the war were also committing crimes against Serb population, and that Croats were not the only victims. So then we go on. This man comes in 2010. He's my professor, former professor and now colleague at the Faculty of Law. He teaches criminal procedural law, and he's also a composer. So he came as a candidate of social democratic party of Croatia, and won the presidential elections. Served only one term until 2015. Now we have another first female president of Croatia, who was a candidate of the Central Rightist Party. And in his politics, he pursued the messages of reconciliation towards neighbors, because his competencies as a president gave him a space to act in the foreign policy of Croatia. So president's position or institution of president in Croatia is far from American one, where president is the chief of the executive branch of government. Our president is maybe directly elected, but he has very limited number of competences. One of those competences is participation in creation of foreign policy, and indeed in this part, President voiced his reconciliatory messages towards neighborhood, particularly Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unfortunately, those messages were not well received in the society, because in the society, the predominance of certain interest groups, mostly war veterans who want to keep their privileged position in the society, and also rigid rightist political parties that are trying to remain in some part of power positions by glorifying Croatian role in the recent past and simply denying wrongdoings and crimes committed by Croatia. So they were fiercely opposing President's messages of reconciliation to the region. Of course, President Josipović's behavior helped Croatia in the EU accession process, because his attempts were valued well by the European Union. Unfortunately, his messages were not voiced well in the Croatian society, because he lacked backing of the government that was led at that time by centrist right political party, who is now again in power. And any systemic initiative or approach that would actually voice reconciliation to the wider society through education, to media, to other public channels were not supported by state institutions. They were merely supported and still are only supported by international donors. So reconciliation, it's still an issue to be achieved in Croatia and in neighboring region. Unfortunately, it has been pursued merely by some prominent figures, Ivo Josipović, President Josipović being one of them, and by analyzing his reconciliatory frames or messages from his speeches, I came to the conclusion that his messages were mostly intended for the foreign audience, for the neighboring countries, and fearing the attacks from the Rightist and World War Veterans Association side. He was much more silent in those messages at home. Given said that, I would end this presentation, and I thank you for your attention.